Welcome, welcome everybody. I'm Garry Adelman with the American Battlefield Trust, and here I am at one of my favorite places, the National Museum of Civil War Medicine here in Frederick, Maryland, and I'm here with an old friend. He's been in this game for decades. This is Dana Shoaf. He is the Director of Interpretation here at the museum. Dana, welcome.
Thank you. I'm really glad you guys are here. It's really exciting, and it's a beautiful day in Frederick. Everything's working out so well.
It is indeed.
Yeah.
So what is the National Museum of Civil War Medicine?
I like to call our museum the most unique Civil War museum there is because we focus exclusively on the medical aspect of the conflict. And in my opinion, emancipation is its own separate huge area, but one of the easiest ways to draw a direct line between the Civil War and our modern lives is through the medical history that starts during that conflict. We'll learn more about that here today.
Yeah, I can't wait. Now, it says it's a museum, but you guys are more than just a brick and mortar museum.
We are much more than that. We have our own YouTube channel. We do outreach events. There are two other sites that we help administer. The Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office in DC. We work with the Park Service at the Pry Field Hospital on the Antietam battlefield. And we're always entertaining tour groups and field trips. We interpret and display this stuff for educational purposes. And that's exactly why these items were saved as well, because the surgeons and doctors of the Civil War wanted to learn from this chaotic experience and the casualties that were caused to improve medical health. So they kept a lot of specimens and things like that so they could improve medical science.
Now, I'm anxious to get inside, but I know you wanted to talk about your founder.
Yes, Gordon Dahlman, a Midwestern dentist, had an interesting and large collection of medical artifacts, and he wanted to display them to help educate the public. So he looked for locations, and in 1993, he arrived on this location. This is the Carty Building, C-A-R-T-Y, in downtown Frederick. Part of this structure stood during the Civil War, and it's where furniture and even some caskets were made here as well. Embalming was done in this building after Antietam. So it's a long story I'll make short, but it was with help from the city of Frederick and the state of Maryland. This building was purchased and renovated, and what you're going to see here is what it looked like after the major renovations were done in 2000.
Okay, well, here comes the part where I push your curators to open up cases and let us get up close with some stuff.
Yeah.
We're going to have some guests along the way. Hopefully, Melissa and Sarah will join us
we'll
inside.
see some people in there, right?
Yeah, let's go inside right
excellent.
on now.
All right, let's go.
So now here we are inside one of the many immersive exhibits they have here. Sort of a hallmark of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine is these immersive exhibits that they work in with artifacts. And before we get into much about the history, let's talk about this artifact here, Dana.
Right, so behind us is a tent that belonged to Surgeon John Wiley of the 6th New Jersey Infantry. It is the only surviving tent that was used by a Civil War surgeon that we know of. This came to the museum. The founder of the museum, Gordon Dahlman, loaned this artifact to us, and it still stands here. Wiley had a long career with the 6th New Jersey, so this tent could have seen some significant action and use during the conflict.
And you see it, and you see the soldiers sort of around us here. You know, we're seeing some advancements here in Civil War medicine. I see an open sort of situation here. You see people laid out onto the ground. What's something you might say about that?
Well, this camp life diorama is important because it explains that most people die of disease. Most soldiers die of disease rather than bullets during the Civil War. 2/3 of all those who died, and that's like more than 700,000 people, die of disease. And a lot of these diseases originate in these crowded, huge camps that often were larger than some established cities. You know, 80,000 men, 100,000 men could be in some of these camps. And it's just a proper breeding ground for bacteria. The Army of the Potomac had a medical director named Jonathan Letterman, we'll be discussing again, who began reforms to establish protocols for the way camps were laid out to improve air circulation, better use of latrines, and it did cut down on diseases. But that's what people learn about in this particular gallery.
Yeah, and it's so much more than that, of course, and we'll get into this as we go into the museum more, because it doesn't end with just camps. It's ambulances, it's hospitals, it's who's doing what.
Yeah.
But let me just say that, what would you say to people, because I run into this on tours a lot, people who say, you know, I'm much smarter than the people of the past, those idiots that did it in this way. I tend to tell them that imagine if you went back into the past and said, wait, wash the saw, and they say, why? And you explain that there's little things that live on you, and some are good and some are bad, trust me. I mean, they'd probably lock you up.
They would. You know, the germ theory that we take for granted now was sort of in its infancy at the time. And it wasn't widely accepted because of the very fact that they just couldn't grasp these tiny little things that you can't see could cause all these diseases. However, Civil War surgeons made immense strides throughout this conflict to improve the health of soldiers and some basic understandings of things that needed to, the three-stage step of removing wounded from the battlefield that saved a lot of lives. And if they hadn't made those advances, the death toll would have even been higher. These are well-trained people in most cases. These surgeons had gone to medical school, but they didn't have experience with the tremendous carnage, how would they, that the war causes? So they weren't used to dealing with bodies that were shredded by canister or musket fire. And that creates a whole different series of medical challenges that these men adapt to as the war goes on and improve.
And I know we want to move on to another space, but just one more question for you.
Sure.
Is it an overstatement to say that if someone in your family has been saved by, triage or by the 911 system, that it has something to do, something big to do with what these surgeons did in the Civil War?
Yes, and we will explore some of this as we move along, but I believe that if you want to draw a connection from the Civil War to our present day, one of the easiest ways to do that is through the healthcare system, because the changes and reforms that impacted and help our lives can be directly traced to the Civil War and what these guys learned as they went on during those 4 horrible years.
All right, Dana, lots more to see.
So one of the more unusual artifacts we hear at the museum certainly is this mummified arm. And Sarah Bierle just referred to this as an artifact of someone's worst day. And I think that's a really good way to describe this. This arm was found reportedly near the Burnsides Bridge on the Antietam battlefield. We don't know much about it. We don't really know much more than what the sign here tells us, and that is it was a young man, 16 to 18-year-old Caucasian arm, and it was removed not by surgery or amputation, but by trauma. So it's very possible that this was literally blown off during some of the fighting near Burnsides Bridge. And again, just because of the nature of it, we don't know much about it. But we're respectful with this artifact, and we use it to prove a larger point, which is that battlefields are still graveyards. There are still relics like this out there. Recently, Confederate bodies were found in Colonial Williamsburg. They were found not long ago on the Manassas battlefield. And that, of course, the mission of the ABT is to preserve battlefields, and that's one of the reasons it's important, because they're still the resting places of these young men that went off to war. So we have this located, it's very easy to find, but sort of in the back of this hallway, because again, it can be very shocking, but we use it as an educational tool and also to bring back the human element, if you will, to all these stories that we tell about medicine and survival in the Civil War.
As we're continuing to make our way through galleries here at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, we've come to a gallery that highlights the use of ambulances to quickly move wounded soldiers from a battlefield area or to transport sick soldiers to a base hospital. This is part of Jonathan Letterman's system that's so important for moving troops, sick troops, or casualties rapidly to medical care. And to talk more about this, Dana, you've got a special military order that actually set all of this in effect.
Right. So in August of 1862, Jonathan Letterman, who was then the medical director of the Army of the Potomac, along with George McClellan, who was the Army commander, issued General Orders 147, which established an ambulance corps for the Army of the Potomac. I was surprised to learn when I came here to work that the United States Army didn't use ambulances before the Civil War. They relied on wagons from the quartermaster department, which was often inefficient, and there weren't enough of them. But Letterman realized that there was an issue with that, so he will organize this ambulance corps and structure it so that each element of the Army of the Potomac has ambulances available to them after an engagement. Letterman also, even earlier than in the conflict, with Major General William Rosecrans, will develop an ambulance known as the Rosecrans ambulance, a light, efficient ambulance that can carry 4 prone men or be reconfigured to carry up to a half a dozen to 8 seated casualties. Requires 2 horses to pull it. And that's what you see behind you. This diorama explains that ambulance system and how it was used to quickly get guys off the battlefield, saving thousands of lives probably in the long run.
Absolutely, and the innovations that we see with this rapid transportation, this dedicated transportation to and from medical care is so important. I do want to point out though, because we often talk about the ambulances, the innovation, that's important. Speed and time is going to help to save lives in the Civil War setting. But keep in mind the experience of a wounded man placed in a horse-drawn wagon. Yes, some of them have better springs, but it's still a very painful experience. Sometimes it's going to be a few miles of a journey from a field dressing station to the field hospital where there's going to be more medical care given. There's accounts of men saying that their ambulance ride made them feel like their bones had gone to jelly. So think about the challenges that we have there. And I also want to point out that on the other side of the lines, Dana's given us a great overview with the Army of the Potomac, but Confederates are developing similar systems. We do see in the Shenandoah Valley in 1862, Dr. Hunter McGuire, medical director for Stonewall Jackson, is also pioneering similar attempts with dedicated ambulance wagons. You'll see similar innovations with other armies, Union and Confederate, fighting in other regions during the Civil War.
That's a good point. In Richmond, I know there was a Richmond Ambulance Committee, which was organized to help provide and produce ambulances for the Confederate Army. And one of the things I had mentioned before was about how the medical developments of the conflict affect us today. As I said, the Army didn't have ambulances before the war, but they become so widely used. Immediately after the conflict ends, the city of Cincinnati will establish a civilian ambulance service for the first time. And so I like to say when you hear an ambulance siren today, that's the Civil War talking to you.
Another innovation that comes around during the Civil War is the identification of medical personnel in the battlefield area. This can sometimes happen by identifying a hospital setting with certain colored flags, and we also start to see medical personnel themselves wearing items, badges that distinguish them. And Dana, I think we're seeing that portrayed here in this diorama.
Yes, you notice the soldier to my left here has a red band around his cap and also a red chevron. Now in Letterman's General Orders 147, he prescribed a green band around the cap and green chevrons and the point up on those chevrons instead of down like most of them, so that soldiers could easily identify caregivers on the battlefield. And also it helped the esprit de corps of the ambulance workers because they had this distinctive uniform that told the Army we have a certain skill. So these different colors that are applied to the uniforms, essentially, I believe it's the first time in American history that caregivers have been identified on the battlefield. It's the Red Cross before the Red Cross. Just as ambulances and other developments occurred in the medical system throughout the Civil War, inventors also came up with different types of stretchers that were used to convey men off the battlefield. And we have a stretcher up here that folds in half, and it would belong to the 1st New York Cavalry, and you'll see H. Ferry and Martinsburg, Virginia, written actually on the stretcher itself because that's where it was shipped. So that's a really cool detail. This unusual chaise lounge looking item is actually a stretcher designed by a Union surgeon named Coolidge, and it was designed to fold up and down like a chaise lounge to help cushion the wound of the soldier, and it could also function as a temporary hospital bed if needed. This one is really neat because it's stenciled to the 1st Regiment New Jersey Volunteers. So that's documented to a specific regiment. And then people are always interested in these bloody socks. I'm sure many people are aware that we also administer the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office in DC, which is a really interesting story, and check it out online on our website. But it was lost and boarded up to history for years and refound again in 1996. And in the attic of that space where Clara Barton worked during the Civil War, many objects were found, including a huge pile of these bloody socks that all are very similar, these white cotton socks, and it's speculated that she collected these from hospitals in DC, bringing them back to her office, perhaps to men. We're not sure exactly what she was doing with them, but these are still covered with Civil War soldier blood. That's Civil War soldier DNA right on those socks. Jonathan Letterman will establish a 3-stage system for removing the wounded from the battlefield. And this system is very efficient and is really still used by the United States military, and it's called the Letterman system. I do want to briefly mention, though, that this system that Letterman used originated actually in Europe. In the mid-1850s, there was a commission, the Delafield Commission, and Major General George McClellan was part of it at the time when he was a young captain. And they saw the French using a 3-stage system for wounded removal that then Letterman will develop and apply to United States troops. This represents stage 1 of the Letterman system. This is an aid station, and it is a recreation of an aid station on the battlefield of Gettysburg. I don't know if people are very familiar with Gettysburg.
Did you say Gettysburg?
Oh, Garry, it's like the bat signal. You
my God.
say Gettysburg and he appears.
Let me just say that I think you're going to keep going here, but this is an actual recreation, which is really cool. And I'll just leave it with that it's with a surgeon that has an especially cool name.
Right. That surgeon is Z. Boylston Adams, and he was a descendant of the Adams founding father family from Massachusetts. He was the surgeon of the 32nd Massachusetts Infantry, and he establishes stage 1 of the Letterman system, an aid station as close to the front lines as possible to try to stop the bleeding and give men immediate first aid. If you go to Gettysburg today, near the wheat field, across the road from the Irish Brigade Monument, you'll see a boulder that looks just like this with a bronze plaque to this aid station on it. The surgeon here represents Adams, and he worked so long at this aid station that he actually temporarily went blind. He worked for so many hours straight. Because of that, Adams will resign his surgeon's commission. He's afraid to continue working as a doctor, moving ahead of the war, I should say, and he will enlist in a Massachusetts infantry regiment, be badly wounded at the Wilderness, and he will treat his own wound in a Confederate hospital before he's exchanged. It's a really amazing story. But the larger story here is stage 1. This is where you first treat the wounded people, and then they are taken to a field hospital, which is stage 2, where most of the operations occur. And the final stage is the general hospital. And we're going to see those next 2 stages here in just a minute.
The second major step in Letterman's system for evacuating the wounded from the battlefield, getting the medical treatment, hopefully helping them survive and be able to return to their families at home, would have been the field hospital. Now, these were usually located several miles away from the fighting area, making that ambulance transportation so important for getting the wounded quickly to the medical staff that would be performing operations. At the field hospital, a wounded soldier would be triaged. So other assistant surgeons or medical staff are going to take a look at his injury and help to determine what operations are needed if this is a wound that is likely going to be survivable. During the Civil War, we see a change in weaponry. There's the mini ball that is being fired out of rifled guns. So this is a bullet that's going to come out of the barrel of that rifle spinning, moving very fast. If it hits bone, it shatters bone, usually beyond repair. If the shattered bone is in a limb, an arm, a leg, amputation is going to give that Civil War soldier the best chance for recovery. More than 60,000 amputations are performed during the Civil War. And it's easy to look at that number from our perspective here in history and look back and go, oh my goodness, that is horrible. And yes, it was terrible suffering that occurred, but it gave the Civil War soldier the best chance for survival. Remember, this is a period where germs are not understood, so removing an injured part of the body before infection can set in was really important for the soldier's recovery. Most major operations were performed under a type of anesthesia, usually ether or chloroform. You might see behind me that there is an assistant surgeon using a handkerchief. He has a small bottle in his hand. This is one way that those anesthetics could be administered. They would also sometimes use a cone that would be placed over the patient's mouth and nose, the drug put on a sponge in there, and the patient would be told to breathe deeply. Usually this anesthesia was not given to the patient to the point of actual unconsciousness like we experience in our modern surgeries today. Doctors at the time don't know where that fine line between unconsciousness and death is, but they do give enough anesthesia to dull the pain and help the patient make it through the operation. Recovery for Civil War soldiers from an amputation operation depends a lot on that soldier's health and also where the amputation occurs. The further from the trunk of the body that the amputation occurs, the greater chance a soldier has for survival. Survival is also going to be somewhat dependent on what happens to the soldier next. Is he left laying on dirty, bloody straw in a field hospital setting, or is he able to be evacuated more quickly to a base or general hospital, which we'll learn about as we continue our walk through the National Museum of Civil War Medicine.
Now, after soldiers are treated at an aid station or then a field hospital, they might be transported, if they were lucky, to one of the large general hospitals that you see pictures of sometimes around the Civil War. This is where they can get really excellent care, and I know Dana has more to say about this.
Right, Gary. So general hospitals were large, more permanent hospitals that were the third stage of the Letterman system. And the Confederacies had also had large permanent hospitals like Chimborazo in Richmond. These were big. Chimborazo had up to 4,000 beds. There was a huge general hospital in Philadelphia called Satterlee that had its own railroad system. And even towns like Frederick could be turned into general hospital centers after large battles like Antietam, when 27 buildings here in Frederick became hospitals. This case contains some interesting artifacts. This is a United States Hospital Department gown that would be issued to patients in general hospitals. You see this huge hospital flag. Originally that was a bright yellow with a bright green H indicating a hospital. This flew over a massive general hospital at the City Point location used by the Union Army during the Siege of Petersburg. It was brought home by the Surgeon-in-Chief of the hospital from the 80th New York. And here we see a frock coat belonging to a hospital steward. Basically, hospital stewards were the non-commissioned officers of the medical service. These guys performed invaluable duty issuing out medicines and doing paperwork and assisting the surgeons. We're going to continue on here. Take a quick look at this large medicine chest that would have been used in a large stationary general hospital. Behind me, you see this weathered siding. That is from one of the original general hospital buildings at Point Lookout, Maryland. And then you'll walk into this gallery, which depicts a general hospital. This is a recreation of the general hospital at Point Lookout. You see this greenery, and they would put that in the hospital wards to fragrant the air. They really understood that air circulation is important. These hospitals had large windows to increase cross breezes and to keep the air moving. And it's frustrating about Civil War medicine. They develop an understanding of a lot of new techniques like air circulation. If they only understood germ theory better, they could have saved even more lives. But this is what you see depicted here. This is stage 3 of the Letterman system, a large general hospital. And if you made it here, you'd gone through hell, but you had a 90% chance of survival.
Here at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, we're very fortunate to have in our collection this Lincoln arm. It's one of the prosthetics from the Civil War. No relation to the President, Abraham Lincoln. It's actually made by Marvin Lincoln, who was a carpenter too old to enlist in the armies of the Civil War. He used his skills to create a better prosthetic arm. This one has a detachable hand and a spring-loaded thumb to help with grasping objects. There's more than 60,000 amputations performed during the Civil War, which of course leads to sort of a booming prosthetic industry, and the Union Army actually gave a stipend to veterans to purchase a prosthetic, or $75 if you did not.
As the prosthetic limb industry, if you will, continues to advance and grow during and after the Civil War years, one of the Southerners who is involved in it is James Hanger. He was one of the first soldiers to have an amputation during the Civil War. Actually, in the summer of 1861, he loses his left leg. He actually invented his own prosthetic limb and then later went on to sell copies of that to the Confederate government to provide to other Confederate soldiers. His limb was so successful that his company continued on, and to this day, Hanger Incorporate helps to provide prosthetic limbs with new cutting-edge technology. Despite the innovations in Civil War medical care, not all soldiers survived. Whether it was on the battlefield itself, in an aid station, at a field hospital, or in a general hospital, many Civil War soldiers still died of their injuries. When a Civil War soldier died and was buried for the first time, comrades or medical staff would often try to mark his grave so that family could perhaps send for and have his body retrieved and buried in a family cemetery or local cemetery back in their hometown. I'm standing next to a rare artifact, which is a grave marker for a soldier named Charles B. Green, who died in Frederick, Maryland in October 1862. He passed away at one of the general hospitals located in this town, and this was used to mark his grave. Later, his family had his remains exhumed and transported back to his hometown where he was buried. This is a sobering reminder of what sometimes happened in the journeys of Civil War medicine. And while we remember, and in some ways even celebrate, the innovations that come out of the Civil War, there was still a high cost of human life, which cannot be ignored.
In coming through this museum, while you get a lot of heavy, don't get me wrong, what the main message is one of progress. This is one of innovation. This is one of terrible times, but something actually getting better during it. And this artifact we're standing next to, Dana, is a good example of that.
Yeah, this is a really unique item. This is the rear end of a recreated dispensary wagon. And I think these are really remarkable vehicles. The first one was also invented by Jonathan Letterman. We've mentioned his name a lot, but Letterman took an ambulance and converted it into a rolling pharmacy by adding drawers and shelves that you could put medicines in, so you could take that right along with the armies on a march or right into a battlefield. There were a number of these different medicine wagons developed during the war, a number of different models. This was one of the most successful. This is called an Autenrieth, and it was used starting in 1864. And you can see in here all the drawers and the shelving and how it's innovatively put together so things pull out and slide out, and there's bottles of medicines in here and packaging as well. A really great quote from a soldier in the 9th New York called one of these a wagon outfitted like a little apothecary shop, and that's exactly what they were. And modern ambulances today are a hybrid of this dispensary wagon and the ambulance we looked at earlier, which was just made to carry people, because modern ambulances can carry injured or sick people as well as carrying its own stock of medicines.
And it's just incredible. When you go into a store today, they obviously have a back room with all of the milk or the beer carton stand, you know, stacked up or something like that. But now there's a front-facing area where you can go in, grab it, and they restock it from the back. Imagine the old days when they really needed a medicine and it was the 5th crate down.
Right, right. No, before these, the medicines were carried in big, bulky wagons, and you had to fish in them. You know, it was hard to get stuff out of them, and that was Letterman's rationale, make this more accessible. There's a great sketch, an Alfred Woad sketch after the Battle of Antietam, and it shows civilians helping to load men on ambulances. And in that sketch at the far left, you can see a dispensary wagon, and a steward or a medical person is working at the back tailgate, maybe mixing pills, getting bandages, who knows what. But so we know by Antietam that these were in use.
Now, if I'm correct, you're going to remodel this place soon, right?
Right, Gary, we're currently working with a design firm out of Washington, D.C., Healy Kohler. You're familiar with their work at the Adams County Historical Society. And we're going to be redoing all the galleries here in the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. We're going to be keeping the stories that people like and love, but we're adding more stories in. This museum opened in 2000, and a lot has changed in the last 25 years or so regarding Civil War history and the medical history of the conflict, and we're going to be bringing in a lot of new features that really are going to give this a national scale and be, you know, some really amazing human interest stories. But even as we're working on that, we're going to remain open. So we're pretty closely located to Gettysburg, Antietam, Washington, D.C., Monocacy's here in Frederick as well. So I'd like to thank you, Garry, and everyone from ABT for coming out and visiting us. Check us out online, civilwarmed.org. We love to have you come by, and thanks for watching.
And I would just say that, yeah, make this part of your Gettysburg plans. Make it part of your Washington, D.C. plans. We've only shown a tiny portion of the thousands of objects in the collections here at this excellent facility. So I think this and some of the other things we saw are a great example of what they do here. So thanks, Dana. Thanks, Melissa. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Andy Poulton behind the camera. Thank you all for watching and for supporting battlefield preservation and education.
Hello, this is Trace Atkins. To stay up to date on all the latest and coolest videos, please subscribe to the Trust YouTube channel. Preserve, educate, inspire.